Welcome, everyone. My name is John Mollenkopf, and I am consortial faculty at the School of Labor and Urban Studies and teach political science and sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center. Welcome to our second panel of the day, this one on visions of a progressive immigration policy. We come to you today from New York City, a place that has faced many grave challenges in the past as well as today. In the mid-1970s, the city suffered a net loss of 600,000 jobs and 1 million residents. It's not too much to say that immigrants saved the city in the following period. The 9/11 attacks, the financial collapse of 2008, and today's COVID-19 crisis all clearly show how central immigrant origin communities are to the resilience of our city and to our nation. These communities have suffered disproportionately, but they are also contributing strongly to our survival. Our city embraces and celebrates our immigrant communities, but we face an avalanche of destructive policies from the Trump administration. We join communities across the nation in fighting these policies, but today, this session of our conference offers us the opportunity to hear from brilliant, passionate, and effective panelists who will help us think through what we should be for in this context, both as we enter the new year in 2021 and for the longer haul. Let me introduce our panelists. Maria Elena Incapié is Executive Director of the National Immigration Law Center, the leading organization dedicated to defending and advancing the rights of low-income immigrants in the United States. Under her leadership, NILC has grown to be a premier immigrants' rights organization, strategically using litigation, policy development, communications, and alliance buildings to effect social change. Amaha Casa founded and directs the African Communities Together. Amaha has been a labor and community organizer, nonprofit director, and social entrepreneur for 25 years. In a short time, ACT has had a major impact on immigration policy, won numerous campaigns to improve the condition of African workers and community members, and supported the civic engagement of a crucial and growing group of African immigrants in the US. Musa Verchisti, a lawyer, directs the Migration Policy Institute's office at NYU Law School. His work focuses on US immigration policy at the federal, state, and local levels, the intersection of labor and immigration law, immigration enforcement, civil liberties, and immigrant integration. Prior to joining MPI, Mr. Chisti directed the immigration project of the Union of Needle Trades, Industrial, and Textile Employees, UNITE. Peter Markowitz is professor of law at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law and is founding faculty member and co-director of the Catherine O. Greenberg Immigration Justice Clinic. The clinic and Professor Markowitz have played a central role in many critical innovations in the field of immigration law. He is the author of numerous important scholarly papers, including one on immigration enforcement in the Yale Law Journal that will be the focus of his talk today. Finally, Cristina Jimenez is executive director and co-founder of United We Dream, the largest immigrant youth-led organization in the country, which has had a huge impact on public policy and political culture in the United States, including securing the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, which is currently being considered by the Supreme Court. She is also a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Award and is a leading voice for immigrant communities in the media and with policymakers. So, Maria Elena, let me turn the floor to you.
Thank you, John, and thanks to Deepak Bhargava and Ruth Milkman, who I've had the honor of working with for many years, to each of the panelists who I have the deepest respect for, and CUNY and all the organizers of today's virtual conference. Today's conference could not be timelier as the world, society, and our own lives have been upended and are being reshaped by the public health and economic crisis we're experiencing. COVID-19 is reminding us of our shared humanity and has shown us that we are interdependent. Our health and well-being is interconnected with that of our neighbors, as well as with workers across the globe. This recognition is especially important as we celebrate International Workers' Day today. I honor my mother and my father, Teresa and Arturo, who made immense personal sacrifices when we migrated to the United States, leaving behind their families, culture, language, and our beautiful Colombia. They toiled in Rhode Island's factories so that my 9 brothers and sisters and I and my nieces and nephews would have a better life, just like millions of immigrants and refugees have done throughout our nation's history. This public health crisis has exposed the pre-existing fractures in our society, ranging from the weak health and safety net systems, the immigration system, and the labor and economic systems that have historically excluded countless workers of color. These racialized systems of inequity are threatening our collective health, safety, and ability to not merely survive, but thrive. The level of food and economic insecurity is real. We're afraid and anxious about what will come out of all of this, and we're worried about our health and that of our loved ones. We're experiencing collective grief. Let's also remember that prior to COVID-19, we've been experiencing a collective trauma in this country and a sense of hopelessness and despair over the state of our democracy. And for immigrants, what we have been experiencing is nothing short of a war waged by the Trump administration on our families and communities. That's why 6 months into the Trump administration, we at the National Immigration Law Center took a step back with our staff and boards to reimagine the role of immigrants in reshaping the identity of who we are becoming as a nation. We believe that this requires NILC and the movement for immigrant justice to shift from focusing on policies as the end goal to a people-centered approach that recognizes immigrants as essential for their humanity and dignity. NILC believes that immigrants are essential to safeguarding our democracy. While the current administration's rhetoric is about undocumented immigrants, in fact, Trump has focused on restricting legal immigration, which is the administration's way of slowing down the demographic shift and to disenfranchise future citizens and voters of color. We must understand that this anti-immigrant agenda is an attack on our democracy and the diversity of our nation. We must envision a future in which we rewrite the country's fable of being a, quote, nation of immigrants, and recognize that this is a nation of indigenous peoples and of enslaved Africans. We need to reckon with and heal from the racial violence upon which the United States was founded. We must co-create the story of the collective we, which is inclusive, equitable, and grounded in racial, economic, and gender justice, in which everyone can see themselves as belonging in our society. Over the last 2 years, I've had the honor of co-leading the immigrant movement visioning process, along with movement leaders like Cristina Jimenez, Lorela Praeli, Javier Valdez, and Saket Soni, who are all part of this conference today. Along with a cohort of about 50 leaders, we gave birth to a vision for transformational change grounded in 5 freedoms: the freedom to stay, the freedom to move, the freedom to thrive, the freedom to work, and the freedom to transform. The freedom to stay is based on a belief that everyone across the globe should have a fundamental human right to clean, healthy, and adequate air, water, land, food, education, and shelter, and should not be forced to migrate. This requires a global and regional approach to migration and addressing the root causes so that people can thrive in their home countries and are not forced to migrate. This needs to take into account climate change. Second, the freedom to move is premised on the fact that people move across towns and cities, across countries, across oceans, across continents every day, and have been doing so since the beginning of time. People move to be free, to be safe, and to realize their full potential. Our system of immigration laws and policies should facilitate circular migration with full visa portability, labor and human rights, and create a climate migrant category. The freedom to thrive recognizes the inherent humanity in each of us, which requires us to leverage abundant resources and to do away with the scarcity mentality and focus instead on supporting our collective well-being. This means that everyone, regardless of immigration status, should have access to healthcare and safety net programs, mental health, quality and affordable education, workforce development and trainings, and other programs that allow people to fulfill their full human potential. The freedom to work acknowledges that one of the main reasons people migrate is so that they can support their families and themselves. Everyone should have a decent, safe, fulfilling, meaningful, and dignified work, which requires that all workers are guaranteed civil, labor, and human rights. This also means moving away from immigration enforcement that results in the detention and deportation of workers by replacing I-9 audits and raids with W-2 audits and audits of labor and employment practices, so that employers trying to rig the system by exploiting undocumented workers are actually held accountable as the ones who have been depressing wages and working conditions in our nation. And finally, the freedom to transform. At its core, this freedom recognizes that human beings make mistakes and that white supremacy and economic greed are operating through the private prison system. This recognizes the concept that for those who harm, they have been harmed, and that what's necessary is for people to be able to go through their own healing and the healing that we need to do as a country. This freedom calls on society to give immigrants a second chance rather than subjecting them to deportation after they have served time in the criminal justice system. As we look at the rest of the 21st century and take into account the yet unknown ramifications of COVID-19, coupled with climate change, economic inequality, increased turmoil across the globe, technology, and the disruptions to the future of work, what is certain is that we need a new approach. Immigrants must be included in a broader social contract with the government and an economy that works for everyone, not just the privileged few. We need a bottoms-up approach that engages in cross-movement building, telling the real story about the role of immigrants and helping to shape the future of our nation and our democracy. Enacting federal, state, and local policies that expand the legal envelope for what it means to be an inclusive society that is grounded in the 5 freedoms. In times of war or crises, there's an inherent urge to react to present-day conditions and to be constrained by today's political realities, when what is needed is to have the moral imagination to develop laws and policies so that future generations can live a more just and equitable society. In this time of COVID-19, Mother Nature is forcing us to slow down and reimagine a different way of being, a different way of living and working. I believe that while many doors have closed, including our own institutions, there are new openings, and that what seemed impossible just a few months ago is now possible. These 5 freedoms, the freedoms to stay, the freedom to move, the freedom to thrive, the freedom to work, and the freedom to transform, are an offering, a blueprint for this transformational change. Gracias. And the next speaker is Amaha Casa. Amaha.
Thank you, Maria Elena, for those visionary and thought-provoking reflections. It's an honor to be with you. It's during a profoundly challenging and unsettled time for us and for the members of my organization, African Communities Together. We're an organization of immigrants from Africa and their families. And our members are being touched by the current public health crisis and economic crisis on every level. We began our last membership meeting with a reading of the names of community members who had passed away from COVID-19. So we are among the infected, we are among the deceased, we are among the essential workers. Our members are continuing to work as in hospitals and as home healthcare aides in nursing homes, as delivery workers and Amazon warehouse workers, as meatpacking workers who've been ordered to stay on the job by the administration, and in every way keeping the economy and the society going while putting their own lives at risk. And our members from all regions of Africa, from all over the continent, are also among the excluded workers, people who are not being included in federal relief like the stimulus bill or the unemployment, even unexpanded unemployment programs. And just as important, our members are part of the communities, the workers, the immigrants who are fighting back. Today on May Day, members in Northern Virginia are organizing a rent strike against, in Southern Towers, a predominantly African immigrant residential complex against Bell Partners, one of the largest private equity residential landlords in the country. So we are here. We are here to fight. I want to suggest a few things that need to be part of the agenda that Maria Elena laid out. There's been a torrent of anti-immigrant policies, many of them targeting directly our members, things like the African ban, the Muslim ban, the termination of temporary protected status, TPS. And sometimes it feels like there's no logic or reason. It's just the attack of the day. But in fact, there is an underlying logic. And if we look at the Trump administration's 4 pillars on immigration, they line out certain priorities: border security, DACA, terminating the diversity visa program, and terminating what they call chain migration, which we call family unity. So for the Trump administration, controlling what's called future flows of immigrants, how people come here, how we deal not only with those who entered without authorization or became unauthorized while here, but also how we choke off legal migration. It's an essential part of their strategy, and it is, as Maria Elena said, because they are concerned with maintaining demographic superiority and a voting bloc that will prop up a current xenophobic, corporatist political coalition. I want to submit that the immigrant rights movement as a whole has not been sufficiently concerned or active on issues of future flow. It's important that we fight over mass illegalization, like the termination of DACA and the termination of TPS. It's important that we fight over escalating immigration enforcement by ICE and Customs and Border Patrol. It's important that we do all these things. And we need to fight to protect the diversity visa program, which admits 55,000 people per year legally as green card holders. 1/3 of them immigrants from sub-Saharan Africa. My own country, Ethiopia, is the second largest sending country for the diversity visa program. It's important that and the administration has attempted to gut that program. It's part of what was suspended by the latest immigration ban. And we are suing the administration over previous attempts to create procedural roadblocks, like requiring every applicant to submit a passport in countries where that's sometimes impossible. It's important that we continue to fight for refugee resettlement. We have, in the last year, refugee resettlement goals plummeted to something like 20,000 per year, and the likelihood that we are even going to reach those goals is minimal, compared to almost 100,000 in the last year of the Obama administration. When Maria Elena was talking about what freedom to move would look like, the US accepting a fair share of the global responsibility for resettlement would be part of that. And when we think about the fact that countries like Ethiopia, Jordan, Bangladesh, Pakistan accept literally hundreds of thousands or over 1 million of their neighbors, they are, neighboring countries are actually shouldering the majority of the burden of absorbing displaced communities and refugees. It is not, for the most part, developed countries like the US and Europe. So I want to pose a question. what if we were to set a very modest goal relative to the size of our percentage of how many refugees we would accept? 1/10 of 1% of the US's population would equal over 300,000 refugees resettled per year. And I think that that's the scale that we need to be thinking on. I'm going to conclude with that, and I hope we'll have time to get into more discussion in the Q&A period. But I want to challenge us to think not only about illegalization, not only about enforcement, not only about the populations that are here, but the populations that will be here tomorrow and next year and in 10 years. I'm pleased to pass the comments over to my colleague Muzaffar Chisti, who has thought deeply about questions of future flow and other migration policy issues.
Thank you so much, Amaha, and thank you to all of you who are part of this panel. They're all colleagues and friends I've known for a long time. I also want to express my thanks to Deepak and Ruth for organizing this conference at an extremely important moment in our country's history. And I'm particularly grateful to be back in a conference, even though remotely, at the School of Urban and Labor Studies at CUNY, with which and its head, Gregory Mancios, I have long association with, even when I was in the American labor movement. This is May Day, and as we know now, it has been also recalled and retitled Essential Worker Day, not for any trivial reason. If COVID-19, which is the backdrop for all of us, whether we're on the panel or whether listening to this, it reminded us all of the humanity of immigration. In my work over the years on immigration, I think nothing has reminded me more about the human aspect of immigration. Here's a crisis which proved that immigrant workers were the front line of this fight against this virus. Whether they were in the hospitals, whether they were in the fields of the country producing our agricultural products, whether they're processing meat and poultry, whether they were delivering goods to our doors every day so that the rest of us could stay at home. They proved to be the warriors in this fight. And they also proved to be the most vulnerable, the economic decline caused by the pandemic. And then when there was time for Congress even to pass modest relief for the people who had been the victims of the pandemic, the people it actively forgot about was immigrants. And finally, the last thing that we only heard yesterday, that President Trump, when he's thinking about possibly supporting a measure in Congress for states and localities, said that the aid to localities and localities should be conditioned on whether they will get rid of their sanctuary city policies. This is what the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, would call the cruel irony of this whole pandemic. But I think, as Marilyn pointed out, the pandemic has also kind of unearthed and shown light on the basic inequities of a number of aspects in our system. And let me just focus on the inequities of our immigration system. As I said earlier, this has kind of highlighted for all of us the importance of immigrants in our society. But let me specifically talk about the importance of immigrants in our labor market. We know that labor markets are foreign-born people are overrepresented in our labor market in general, but they're hugely overrepresented in the low-wage sector of our economy. And this is from anywhere from 25 to 40% of many occupations in the low-wage sector are foreign-born. When you look at the urban centers of the country, they go into over 50% of low-wage workers in those centers are foreign-born. But we have also known that this didn't happen from nowhere. There are important factors in our society which have contributed to this dependence on immigrants. One is our country's fertility rate is going down. We are becoming an aging society. I don't think any of us need to be reminded that all the baby boomers will become 65 and older by 2030. And we know that for us to support older workers in their social security and retirement, we need to have active, productive workers, which are almost always younger and increasingly immigrant workers. We also become a more educated society. There are more Americans who graduate out of high school, and if you graduate out of high school, typically you don't want to do a low-wage job in this country. So for all these factors, immigrants have become an important component of the labor market, including the low-wage sector of the labor market. But on the other hand, our immigration system is completely broken. If we have an immigration selection system which has a 1952 architecture for the 21st century global economy needs, in which, to put it very succinctly, we let in about 1 million people a year on green cards for the last 15 years on average. Of them, only about 70,000 visas are allotted to people to come on the basis of employment. And of them, only about 5,000 visas are available for people in the low-skilled occupation. So while on one hand, there's a huge demand for the labor of immigrant workers, we don't have the legal options for them to enter. If you just look at the laws of supply and demand, it's not surprising that unauthorized workers are using illegal channels to enter the country or staying as against legal channels which just don't exist. So therefore, if we look now coming to more concrete issues about a future immigration policy should look like, it has to address this fundamental dilemma of our immigration selection system and the need for foreign labor. We know that we have like 4 buckets, streams of immigration to our country: family, employment, refugees, and diversity. And let me quite quickly point out that this is not about what is good for immigrants. We don't have an immigration policy to benefit immigrants. We have an immigration policy to benefit national interests of the United States. We take people who are refugees because that's in the national interest of the United States in our foreign policy context. We take people in diversity immigration because diversity is an important value for the country. And family unification is an important value. Where we have huge need to make a reform is in the employment-based system of our immigration. And we at the Migration Policy Institute have been thinking rather deeply about what a redesigned immigration selection system in the employment base should look like. And let me just quickly summarize the elements of that. I believe that on 2 ends of the spectrum of employment base. One is the purely seasonal workers, which is agriculture workers coming to do one crop. We could allow people to come in as seasonal temporary workers. The expectation is they'll stay here for a short period of time and then go back home. On the other end of the stream, we should have people who we normally call sort of people of extraordinary ability. If John Mollenkopf wanted to get an extraordinary scientist working on COVID research to CUNY, he should not have to wait years to be able to get a green card. But those are the 2 extremes. In the middle is where the debate is. And it's in the middle that we have had a broken immigration system in a long time. Currently, let me just be obviously completely blunt on this. The immigration employment-based system is the only method through which we enter new feeder immigrants. And that's today almost all focused very narrowly on high-skilled immigrants, principally people who come to the H-1B visas. 74% of those people are computer-based occupations. And about 6 companies in the country dominate those visas. That's just not a fair way of a selection system. We believe that if we have a selection system, it should cover the entire spectrum of occupations. And we are suggesting we have, going forward, a new concept that instead of either the temporary or permanence, which is a strange divide, we have a visa category called a bridge visa, where people come in and they're sponsored by an employer, and the employer will have to prove that they're not displacing a US worker, or they're pre-certified because of their history of good labor and immigration law conduct over time. And workers come in the spectrum of occupation, and they come for probably 2 to 3 years of a bridge visa category. At the end of 2 to 3 years, they get the right to extend their stay for about 3 more years. At the end of the 3 years, they have 2 choices. Either by them, they have liked the country or the occupation they're in, or the employer has liked them, and they have an opportunity to adjust to a green card. But they don't have to. If they want to return to their country and come back a few years later on another bridge visa, they should have the freedom to do it. In this system, we would make sure that the rights of both the US workers and the foreign workers are protected. The bridge visa people who we admit should have the right to join a union. They should have the right to bring a cause of action against an employer. More importantly, they should have the right to move one employer to the other. If they find a better job, a better employer, they should not be bonded to the employer that sponsored them. And then at the end of 6 years, if they want to move back to the country, they have the option to do it. Let me tell you the relevance of this. I think it protects the US and foreign workers both. It increases, I think, the mobility and, more important, the circularity. We don't have a concept of circularity in our immigration. That once you get a green card, you get to stay here. And I think in the world today, people are quite comfortable in living in more than one place. And this opportunity allows them the circularity to do that. And the last point I would make is that the numbers are important. Who determines what this category of employment-based immigration should be? And we have recommended that this should be taken out of politics, that we should have an independent commission which is staffed by experts who look at the demographic, economic, and the labor market trends of the country and fix the numbers of people we should admit every year. And that can change over years depending on a phenomenon like 2008 or COVID, or which will then decide the number for the next year. I think this is the vision we believe of going forward with the new selection system. But before I conclude, let's not forget that we still have close to 11 million unauthorized people in the country. Any reform movement that does not address their plight will not work. We need to have a legalization program which will let them come out of the shadows and be members of the society. And with that, let me turn over to my friend and colleague, Peter.
Thanks so much, Moose. And thank you to all my co-panelists and to the conference organizers and frankly to everybody who's joined us here today. I'm going to talk about a radical vision for a just and effective immigration enforcement scheme. And I want to start by acknowledging that this is somewhat of a strange and uncomfortable topic. Members of the immigrant rights movement, which I consider myself, don't usually spend our time thinking about how to make enforcement more effective. Indeed, to many of us, the idea of a just and effective enforcement scheme is an oxymoron. So I want to start from the proposition that we don't want an effective immigration enforcement scheme unless it's just, and that we can't build that system until we have the type of substantive reform that Moose and the other panelists have talked about. That is a necessary co-requisite to go hand in hand with what I'm talking about. But our movement has spent a lot of time thinking about affirmative visions for the substantive reform, about, as you just heard, about pathways to legalization and the right kind of future flow that we need. And we've also spent a lot of time with a negative vision about what's wrong with our enforcement system. We know mass detention and mass deportation and the entanglement with the criminal justice systems. We've identified what we don't need. But largely missing from the public debate has been an affirmative vision for what an effective and just system could look like. If we abandon mass deportation and detention, and if we reform those substantive rules to deal with pathways to citizenship for undocumented folks and realistic and humane future flow, how then would we enforce our immigration laws? Because inevitably, like all legal schemes, there are always going to be some category of individuals who remain out of compliance. I realized I didn't have an adequate answer to this question a few years ago when calls to abolish ICE began to arise. Putting to one side the strategic and political issues around those calls, which I think reasonable people can differ on. On the merits, the calls to abolish ICE, frankly, to me, sounded like a no-brainer. I had been representing folks facing removal and representing immigrant communities for almost 2 decades, and I was familiar with ICE's notorious track record of brutality and lawlessness. But not only that, even by its own measures of success, ICE's mass detention and deportation systems have failed as a law enforcement strategy, right? We've probably heard the statistic that we spend more on immigration enforcement now than on all other federal law enforcement combined. And meanwhile, over the ICE's lifetime, the undocumented population has increased dramatically, approximately 70% by DHS's own numbers. But I didn't have and I didn't hear an adequate answer to the predictable and reasonable questions of what would come next. How would we enforce those laws? And it struck me that past significant efforts to reform our immigration laws, enforcement reform had usually been at best an afterthought, and at worst and more often a bargaining chip that some politicians were willing to throw away toward the laudable but inadequate goal of the substantive reforms we've been hearing about. So in order to ensure that that pattern didn't repeat, I propose that we must develop and coalesce around an affirmative vision for what enforcement should look like. And so I spent the greater part of the last year looking at other federal agencies who all seem to be able to find ways to enforce their civil schemes without putting people in cages. And I spoke to leaders across the immigrant rights movement about what just enforcement could look like. And the result is a new framework for immigration enforcement centered around 4 pillars. And while it was developed in response to the question of what could come after ICE, my hope is that these ideas, which are a starting point to be critiqued and built upon, are relevant whether or not ICE is around. One caveat before I jump into those 4 pillars, which is that I was really focused on the question of ICE and interior enforcement. And I just want to acknowledge that there is a separate, enormous problem on our borders that call for very different types of solutions, ones that need deep inquiry, but are separate from what I'm about to go through. The first pillar is about optimal scaling, right? DHS was founded with the misguided goal of 100% enforcement. That is, its goal was to deport each and every person who is amenable to deportation. And that's not the way other agencies operate. And that goal has led to ICE's incredible escalation of resources and unprecedented scale, with more people deported in the first 15 years of the 21st century than were deported in the entire 150 years previous. And what we need instead is to decide how much enforcement is in the public interest. There are realms, take the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, where we might want 100% enforcement because the cost of a single incident of breach could be so devastating societally. But in other places, like marijuana laws, prostitution, quality of life crimes, and even tax laws, policymakers are increasingly recognizing that the affirmative decision to make low levels of enforcement are optimal. To determine what level of enforcement is optimal, I would propose that we need to balance the societal and individual costs of enforcement, right? It costs dollars and it hurts people. And then we need to weigh that against the additional compliance that punitive enforcement can trigger and the societal benefits associated with that compliance. I don't have time to walk through that analysis in detail here, but I conclude that the analysis militates in favor of a dramatic scale down, at least to historic norms, in terms of the amount of enforcement we need. The second pillar has to do with embedding a mandatory preference for the promotion of compliance over the punishment of non-compliance, sometimes referred to as cooperative enforcement. And it's a trend across administrative law. The government seems to have no problem with the idea that it's better to help entities come into compliance than it is to punish entities for non-compliance when those entities are corporations. That's the way OSHA behaves, the SEC behaves, the EPA behaves. It's even the way the IRS behaves. And immigration has it exactly upside down. There are lots of people who are eligible to regularize their or maintain their status. But they're also potentially subject to deportation under current laws. And our system yanks people out of the pathway towards legalization and sends them into the deportation pipeline. We need to do exactly the reverse. And the traditional mechanism that we've used to sort between those two pipelines has been prosecutorial discretion, and it has utterly failed to deliver a reliable preference for compliance assistance. And so what we need are mandatory rules that anyone who has a pathway to legalization be allowed to pursue that pathway to completion such that they cannot be subject to punitive enforcement, deportation, until that avenue has been exhausted. But of course, turning to pillar 3, there are always going to be some people who cannot be brought into compliance and where the judgment will be made that enforcement is necessary. The current problem I propose is that we have only a single penalty in the immigration toolbox, deportation. And it's a penalty that is grossly disproportionate to the overwhelming majority of immigration offenses. A binary choice between no penalty and the harshest penalty possible is not the way other systems work. It's like a medieval criminal justice system where the only choice is no penalty or the death penalty. So instead, we need to implement a system of scalable penalties or consequences to address noncompliance in proportion to the violation and the circumstances of the individual. Fines are the most obvious and widely used in other civil schemes. And their fines have a history of being used in the immigration system as well in earlier eras, where you pay a fine and then a pathway to legalization opens up. There are other examples that I can't go through now, but the idea of letting the immigration judges find a penalty that matches the offense is critically important. The final pillar has to do with creating a humane replacement to preemptive detention. Right? The scale of detention, like the scale of deportation, is entirely out of whack with history. And I presume that even when we scale our system down, way down, and we first give a preference to letting people try to legalize, and there's a system of scalable penalties, there will still be outlier cases where deportation is the ultimate penalty delivered. Not endorsing that, I'm just presuming that. And the question then is, how, if we don't have detention, do we ensure that people show up to court and comply with those orders? And I say that there are a few things that we can do. And the first has to do with data that we have recently gotten from TRAC around the impact that lawyers have. When families were released from detention and they had lawyers, 99% of them appeared at each and every one of their immigration proceedings. And when they didn't, a much lower percentage in the 70s appeared. Lawyers do a lot of things, and there are lots of good reasons why we should give folks lawyers that have nothing to do with appearance rates. But if we care about making people appear in court, give them lawyers. I'm running short on time, so I'm going to just be brief, but there are also a system of inducements that have been experimented with in other countries to ensure compliance. And there are important lessons from the reentry movement in the criminal justice system that we can leverage as well to make sure that people who do face removal have the ability to survive and thrive. So I propose that a system built around these four pillars would both significantly increase compliance, do so at greatly reduced cost, and do so in a humane system that is not centered around detention and deportation. It's a starting point, and I hope the movement takes up the call to create a unified vision of what enforcement should look like. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Cristina Jimenez.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you to the City University of New York and Deepak and Ruth for your leadership to bring us to this important conversation in this critical time for the country. United We Dream, we believe that people closest to the pain are closest to the solutions. And I want to share a brief example of how that comes to life. Just last night, a federal judge ordered that ICE release immigrants who they're holding in Florida for profit detention camps in violation of the CDC's COVID safety guidelines. This came only after immigrant leaders and family members of immigrants in those detention camps came together with lawyers from the Southern Poverty Law Center and pushed for change. And weeks earlier, the community got ICE to stop requiring immigrants to stand in long lines for needless check-ins in Miramar, Florida. Today is International Workers' Day. And as you can see, all of us are struggling to stop the spread of the virus But while we're also doing that, immigrants and allies are also having to fight ICE agents that are making things just worse for all of us. I am glad to be able to grapple with this question with all of you. The question of what is the future of immigration policy change and how that should look like. As a New Yorker, it is great to be having this conversation happening here within CUNY. And as someone who grew up in Jackson Heights in Queens, which is now the epicenter of COVID deaths and the epicenter of inequity, it is very appropriate to be having this conversation. Elmhurst Hospital, the one and only hospital serving thousands of working class people and immigrants in Elmhurst, in Corona, in Jackson Heights, was under-resourced before COVID. And now the world is seeing just how dangerous that public policy negligence has been. The housekeepers, parking lot attendants, cooks, dishwashers, grocery workers, and delivery people who make the lifestyle of New York City possible are dying. And across the country, immigrants are being forced to work to continue standing shoulder to shoulder on this slaughterhouse line without any protection. As COVID infection rates climb, they are being forced to work and risk death so that Americans can have their peak of fresh meat and produce during this global pandemic. Across the country, undocumented workers are cleaning medical facilities with little, if any, protective gear. And while most of us and many undocumented immigrants have lost their jobs due to this COVID pandemic, the tax-paying records of immigrants have been used to strip them from stimulus assistance in Congress. Immigrants are the first responders to the human needs of America. But when it comes to the human needs of immigrants, American politics and too many of our policy and strategic conversations treat immigrants as if we have no human needs at all. At United We Dream, most of our staff, leaders, and members are undocumented or have undocumented family members. No one feels the pain of a politics which has normalized and built up immigration enforcement as much as we do. That's why we're all laser focused on winning concrete changes to policy to ease that pain in our communities. So when we say that we believe that the future of immigration policy should include abolishing ICE as we know it, we mean it. When we say that the future of immigration policy should include citizenship for all, we mean it. And when we say that the future of immigration policy and the policies that will focus on rebuilding from this crisis should include worker protections for all and healthcare access for all, including undocumented immigrants, we mean that too. I know that this determination of our movement has sometimes been derided as an ideological indulgence. But let me tell you that when ICE agents are busting down your doors or holding people in COVID-infested cages, ideological purity is the least of our concerns. Our demands have grown out of a practical assessment of a decades-old political framework, which has proven to be a failure. The idea that victories for immigrants can only happen when our movement publicly accepts increases in enforcement has failed. I was a student in CUNY in 2002, right after 9/11. And back then, the thinking was that advocates for immigrant rights needed to be practical and accept enforcement increases. The strategy to confront the enforcement agencies head on emerged after seeing the strategy of normalizing those enforcement agencies fail. At United We Dream, the strategy is a very practical one. We set out to stop the bleeding and to solidify the floor on which we were fighting. This involves calling out the horrors led by ICE, building political alliances, and growing the power needed to reverse the winds. No policy change happens in a vacuum. And we know that without a clear intervention, the power of ICE will continue to grow as it has year after year. Many organizations have ramped up our calls to dismantle the deportation machine and to end the bad strategic decisions which built it. One example is the Defund Hate Coalition, which we're proud to be a part of with the Detention Watch Network, Indivisible, Move On, and many other organizations. Over 7 billion has been stopped from going to the deportation force since the coalition's inception. And to give you a sense of just how significant these changes are, the block of House members in Congress committed to rejecting more funds for ICE and Border Patrol grew from 19 in February of last year to 75 in December. That's about a third of the Democratic caucus in the House so far, and the direction of politics at every level is beginning to shift. After decades of unquestioned increases in detention camps, prisons, and criminality narratives aimed at Black and Brown people, we are seeing movement in a new direction. Is the polling all the way there yet? Of course not. Is the majority of Congress there yet? No. But the cultural and political shifts necessary to provide relief to our people are underway. More people know what ICE is, and the agency is losing credibility and support. This is a practical strategy, which is beginning to crack the dangerous status quo of enforcement increases. I and some of us have put our necks out there and have gotten a lot of heat for the audacity of saying that immigration reform should protect immigrants without hurting them. I remember just a recent interview with a reporter who badgered me on how many people should be allowed in the country, how many ICE agents are too many, how many detention beds were acceptable, and even tried to get me to give him a quote saying that some immigrants or that immigration may be bad. In short, he was trying to get me to publicly project compromises and details when no compromise or details were on the table. The Trump policy when it comes to immigration enforcement can be summed up in just one word: more. It doesn't work to oppose this clarity with, well, okay, maybe a little less. DACA is the clearest example of how a policy change can protect immigrants without hurting them. Far from a permanent victory, DACA was a stepping stone in what it was, a blessed relief for those who benefited from it. Look, immigrants know about compromise and how to navigate a complex terrain of politics, racism, and economic inequality. Quite frankly, it is how most of us survive on a daily basis every day of our lives. And those of us who lead movement organizations know that we are engaged in a lifelong journey towards racial and economic justice, which would include many victories and advances along the way. With each victory, a sense of what is possible should grow, and our understanding of the vulnerabilities of our adversaries should deepen. We should not be presenting the same analysis in 2050 as we are in 2020, just as the analysis from 2020 should be different today than it was in 1990. So throughout this conference, I invite you to keep your horizons broad as we seek solutions together. I ask you to not be limited to the constrained thinking of writing a single bill for a single period of time, but to add to your charge, a fundamental refocusing of the fight towards policies which protect immigrants without hurting them. And I am excited for the discussion today and look forward to continue strategizing with all of you. Back to you, John. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for those thoughts and insights and perspectives on how we should proceed. I'm going to ask all the audience members to funnel questions that they might have through the website so that we can make a list of them. And I'm going to start with a question for every panelist who cares to respond to it. Assuming that there's an administration in January of 2021 that's amenable to repairing immigration policy, what are the one or two things that you would put on the top of that list for immediate action? And anybody who would like to respond, feel free. Maria Elena.
Sure, thank you, John. I was waiting to see if somebody else. So given COVID-19 and the fact that it's exposing that immigrants are among the essential workers, and we know that immigrants are playing a protagonist role as first responders to this crisis, yet the fact is that immigrants have always been essential, not just during this pandemic. Immigrants have been harvesting and preparing our food, working in our meat packing and poultry plants, cleaning the office buildings we work in, cleaning the hotels we stay in. Immigrants work at the local grocery stores we rely on. There are small business owners, our teachers. They've been taking care of our loved ones for years. And so that's why today we at the National Immigration Law Center and our partners at Resilience Force have launched the hashtag Immigrants Are Resilient campaign, which we invite everybody to join. And our goal is to reshape the conversation about the role of immigrants in our society, to create the cultural and political conditions to achieve inclusive policies at the federal, state, and local levels. And that includes electing a new president in November. The stakes are absolutely too high. And so in the first 100 days of that next administration, it means that we need to focus first and foremost on correcting and undoing a lot of the harm that we've lost. We've lost a lot of ground under the current administration. And this includes things like rescinding the public charge regulation, which threatens our democracy, rescinding the Muslim, African, refugee, asylum, healthcare, and all the other immigration bans. It includes rescinding interior and border enforcement, executive orders that this administration has put in place that make everybody a priority for deportation. They've further militarized the southern border, and we need to reinstate prosecutorial discretion, which has been used by administrations for decades. We need the next president to also end worksite raids and immigration enforcement at or near sensitive locations. This includes places of worship, schools, hospitals, and to expand the definition of sensitive locations to include courthouses as well, shelters, benefit offices, DMVs, and so on. There's a long list of other things that could be rescinded, including ending the Migrant Protection Protocol, or the AKA Remain in Mexico program, and family detention. But we also know that the next administration within the first 100 days needs to sign executive orders restoring and expanding DACA and redesignated and expanding the protections for temporary protected status and deferred enforced departure for holders, including protections for immediate family members. And then finally, I would just say, given COVID-19, we need the next administration to recognize the role of immigrants as essential workers to the recovery and reconstruction by providing them with legal status. And that's either by working through Congress, depending on the makeup of the Senate based on the November elections, or through executive action.
Muzafer Chisti explained that our current immigration policy is really pursuing national interests. And one of the questions is, well, two of the questions actually deal with this question of national interest. One is a lot of immigration is fostered by desperation and economic collapse in the countries of origin. And so survival of crossing borders is one of the motivations. And that doesn't exactly fit into the four categories that you outlined, Muz. So we're wondering, what what latitude should be given for that kind of motive within the regulatory framework. And a related question is that a lot of migration is stimulated by US foreign policy activities in various ways. And to what extent do we have an obligation of allowing for that within our regulatory framework? And maybe Mos can begin by answering, and anyone else who wants to weigh in can add to that. Mos, you're muted.
Thank you, John. So let me can I just take a minute on responding also to the first 100 days, because part of this panel is to talk about progressive policies at the concrete level. So I think a lot of what Marilyn has said are right. And I think we know that there's a lot of thinking around the country going on, unwinding Trump, and that becoming the first sort of set of priorities for a new administration. Let me quickly just take half a second before I get back to your question, John, is that in the first 100 days, this is literally the first few things that the new president will have to do. I think a new president who will come will have to declare that there's a new day in America on the issue of immigration, in sort of the same way as Trump decided to declare that there was a new sheriff in town. This is going to be the new frame of the new president. He has to say something quickly to make that point. And I would say that just the refugee admissions is probably the most important statement, not only because it sends the first signal to the world that this is a different country, that we have really reneged on our commitment to the international community and to the rule of law. We are going to amend that. I would actually not be surprised if Biden becomes the next president. That's one of the few things he can do, because it also is one of the few things you need the least sort of consultation or permission by Congress. So I expect that to be about 125,000 a year, which is pretty close to what was at the promise at the end of the Obama administration. And that would also take care, hopefully, John, of some of the populations that you talked about in terms of facing turmoil and uncertainty. I think we have not paid enough attention to DACA. DACA will dominate a good part of the discussion between now and the election. It just so happens conveniently, the Supreme Court is going to make a decision on this. That will append the debate in a very fundamental way. It could obviously either energize the Trump's base or it could energize the Latino base, depending on how the decision comes out. But if there is an uncertainty in the lives of DACA people, by the time a new president comes in force, essentially that Supreme Court would have said that the decision of DACA was okay, and that Congress would not have intervened until then to rectify the situation. The very early challenge a new president would have to do what to do with the DACA population. I think sending a different signal on the asylum, because we really have gutted the asylum system at the border by a series of policies. And separation of families is only just one cruel example of that. So I think it's kind of backing off from the policies, whether it's the transit country rule, whether it's remain in Mexico, whether it's sort of metering. I think all those policies are first 100 days policies. And I think just to make the point that Peter made, I think Biden at some level has promised that he will put a moratorium on immigration. Assuming Biden is president, we'll have to see what that means. And I think the least we could expect that he would say, look, for first 100 days, I'll put a moratorium on immigration, and I'll put a task force in place which will tell me what enforcement mechanism should look like in the presidency. And that hopefully takes into account some of the things that Peter outlined in his pillars, which are all elements of a decent policy. And if you just give me one more, if talking about the responding to the point that you made, I think in an odd way, this new bridge visa that we are advocating advances even those challenges about what do you do with people who are not fleeing persecution in the traditional ways, but are fleeing poverty and chaos. Is that we think that actually creates a certain amount of safety valve even for that population. That I could see that people who are now taking on to the difficult smuggler-run routes to reach the US border could come through an employment-based program in the bridge visa. And that could sort of become one of the safety valves in that mechanism, in that scheme for people to enter through that route as well.
You raised the likelihood of lots of responses to the Supreme Court decision on DACA, and a number of audience members have asked that question, and perhaps both Maria Elena and Christina could weigh in on that as well as Peter, so we get the views of our lawyers and activists on that specific question. Maria Elena, do you want to begin? Or
sure, and John, what is the question exactly? Just what happens?
How should we prepare to respond to the Supreme Court decision?
So, we have those of us who've been working in the Home is Here campaign, and we've got the National Immigration Law Center. One of our cases is before the Supreme Court. It actually is, the lead plaintiff is Martin Batalla, who is one of those healthcare workers right now that is an essential worker helping in the COVID-19 response. And we're preparing for all of the different scenarios, including the most recent filing to the Supreme Court was a request that the Supreme Court actually postpone its decision. So that is one of the possibilities. The other possibility in the worst case scenario is that the court decides that President Trump had the legal right to terminate the program, but would still allow DACA recipients to maintain their own individual work authorization. And so there are a number of different scenarios that we're preparing for. And look, at the end of the day, the important thing is that we know that DACA was temporary, and that what we need to do, what DACA recipients have been able to do in this country, is change the conversation about their role, their families, their loved ones. And we know that we're going to keep fighting. The outcomes of the November election are critical to the future of DACA recipients, and not just DACA recipients, but frankly to all immigrants into our nation as a whole. And I'm sure Christina and others have thoughts on that as well.
Christina?
Yes, I would like to add just, two quick points here. One, that the victory of DACA was because of movement pressure and organizing that was relentless against the Obama administration. And not only changing the conversation and culture, but really forcing one of the most powerful people in the world to change policy was because of the movement work and the courage of undocumented young people. So, we don't have a crystal ball to say exactly where the Supreme Court is going to land. And we've been doing amazing work with our legal partners and NILC and many others to be prepared to have different scenarios. But ultimately, all scenarios leave undocumented young people or those who have benefited from DACA, like Martin, who's a member of Make the Road New York, my local organization where I began as an organizer. It's going to leave their lives, no matter what, in limbo and uncertainty, because it is a temporary protection. So what I will say is that the most important question here is to actually know, as a movement and as allies and as a strategist, how do we use this moment to grow our movement, to strengthen our movement, and to, quite frankly, electorize our fight? Because the people responsible for where we are with DACA need to be made clear to the American people. And that is Trump and Congress. And to the point of the election, is that for us as United We Dream and an organization that is building political power and building a movement, the decision day, which could come out as early as next Thursday, is that we need to use this moment to activate millions of people. As one study that we conducted with Professor Tom Wan revealed us that every DACA recipient has an average of 2 eligible voters within their families. That means 1.6 voters that will be indirectly impacted by the DACA decision. So the big opportunity for us as a movement is, how do we energize and activate those 1.6 million voters and millions more to hold this administration accountable and vote them out this November? And that is one way. We will continue to fight for our communities in the streets, in the courts, and at the ballot box. But that's one way that I think it's important for us to keep in mind.
Let me make sure that Amaha has a chance to share his thoughts about the first 100-day question. And then I think we'll go further with this issue of how do we mobilize effectively between the grassroots across the country and the pinnacle decision-making body in Washington, D.C. in the Congress. Amaha.
Yes, so I really resonate with everything everyone has said. And I mean, I think it's worth just stating the obvious, which is it matters not only who's the president, but it matters also who's in Congress. And, you know, over the last few years, we've seen the damage that can be done via prosecutorial discretion, via executive orders and administrative policies. And a lot of the 100 days is going to be spent figuring out how to undo that. But I think we also need to look to Congress for legislative relief in a lot of areas, right? The president can extend temporary protected status or employment authorization, but we really need permanent status. Our TPS holders, many of them have been here for decades, and being re-verified, having their identities re-verified, reapplying year after year after year. And they really need the security of a permanent status and a path to permanent status. And, you know, I'm really proud of our efforts at African Community Together, along with a lot of other immigrant rights and Black immigrant organizations, in passing the Liberian Refugee and Immigrant Fairness Program at the end of 2019, which is going to create which creates a path to permanent status, a path to citizenship for literally thousands of undocumented Liberian immigrants. And this happened during a time when there was very little good news happening around immigration, and particularly around expanding permanent status. And it happened as a result, as Christina said, of movement, right? Not just the movement of Liberians, but of the entire temporary protected status TPS movement. And I think both TPS and DACA are examples of how mass mobilization has reshaped the immigration agenda and taken things that were off the agenda, including permanent status and citizenship, and centered them on the agenda. And so, you know, we've heard some discussion of opinion polls and what will people support or not support on when it comes to immigration. But, you know, opinion polls only measure public opinion, and the point is to change it. And our movements are how we go about doing that. And so I think that we need to not write off legislative action, particularly if there's executive leadership, even in the first 100 days, particularly for TPS holders and for DACA holders.
Peter, a question asks, you make a good point about the function of legal representation, but how do we achieve that on a universal basis? And also other thoughts you might have on the questions that have been raised in the discussion.
Sure. I'm not going to say more on the 100 days because I think it's been well covered, and I fully endorse that what's happened before. I want to just quickly amplify something that Maria Elena and Christina both said on the DACA stuff, which is not to discount how incredibly important this decision is that's coming out and what an extraordinary impact it'll have on people's lives. But however it comes out, DACA recipients will remain in jeopardy, right? That the best we can hope for the Supreme Court is something that buys us some significant period of time. But Trump will come back for DACA recipients if given the time. And so what I want to just amplify is this is really all about kind of the organizing and activating pressure on our politicians, both Democrats who need to understand that they need to draw a line in the sand and stand up when there are essential bills that need to get through Congress, and Republicans who need to understand there's going to be a political cost to pay for this if they let this president do what he intends to do. So I just wanted to amplify that point. But turning to the issue of representation, the history of expansion of right to counsel, be it Gideon right to counsel for criminal defendants or right to counsel for juveniles who are facing representation or parents who are at threat of losing their kids, always started with state and local initiatives showing that these things are possible. And we are not at the beginning. We are robustly engaged as a nation in those types of experiments, right? We have a fully functioning public defender system in New York City and New York State. In New York City since 2014, where there is not one person who faces deportation from detention who can't get a government-funded lawyer, because New York City and New York State have chosen to step up and do that. And there are a number of other initiatives like that percolating around the country at various stages of development. And the biggest obstacle, frankly, the constitutional analysis for why people should get counsel isn't hard. We should win that, without a problem. The real problem is the fear of, is this a feasible thing to implement? And we're showing it is. We're showing it is on scale. And so given where, there are two ways we can get there. We can get there through the courts, or we can get there through Congress. And, a few years ago, I thought the courts were our path of least resistance. I'm rethought that since developments with the Supreme Court, but this seems to me like an achievable goal in Congress with the right Congress and the right president, something that we've shown can work and that could really happen.
Maria Elena?
Thank you, John. Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think this question of universal representation is critical, and it points to a larger issue. As Peter mentioned, New York City, for example, led the way with an incredible program to ensure that everybody had access to legal counsel. I mean, people's lives are at risk when they are detained if they don't have representation. We have some of the most absurd situations of having children, right? Months-old children going before immigration judges. And that should not exist in a country that is supposed to be grounded on the rule of law. Second, I would say, and this is, I think, just to tie the conversation between a number of the different questions, which is Congress and the next president is one part of the solution. But the fact is that for our long-term vision, the vision that I shared about the 5 freedoms, which is really a vision for transformational change in our country for all of us, not just for immigrants, but for all of us, that's going to take us several decades to actually build towards, requires us to build more power and movement at the state and local level. It requires us to build community, including with people who are not immigrants, and including people who don't believe that I or many of us on this panel belong here in this country. The fact is that Congress is often late to the party. They are not actually leading the way. We need to change the culture and create the political conditions for Congress to eventually get there. But the fact is that the majority of Americans already support so much of what we've been talking about here. And so for us at the National Immigration Law Center, what we've seen just in the last 3 years under the Trump administration, through our Winning in the States initiative, is actually the policies are already changing at the state and local level. In just the last 3 years, more than one out of every 2 immigrants now live in a state with access to driver's licenses. Same thing, more than 3 out of every 4 immigrants live in a state that provides access to tuition equity, regardless of status. So again, the changes that are being created at the state and local level will have that ground up pressure on the federal government. Eventually, we need to work on all levels. And with COVID-19, we're now hearing from our state and local partners that access to healthcare is a renewed top priority, along with workers' rights.
Moose, you wanted to make a point? You're muted.
On this right to counsel, I mean, I think that for progressives, we really should be able to make this argument that we are not doing this for immigrants, which is important, but we're really doing this. This is the interest of the country again. I mean, everyone recognizes that our court system is just completely to be 1 million cases in the pipeline of cases. We also, I recognize that many states and localities have provided much more funding for legal services, but that's not across the country. It is again, unfortunately, this red versus blue divide, where people in blue states are getting more representation and more rights than people in red states. It's a particular big problem at the border, which is where the big code crisis is. So I think for us to argue the point about representation, it's not just the points that Peter Mellon made, that if we want an efficient court system, legal representation is important to the efficiency. I mean, how did we get to the Gideon? Because we were able to argue that for the criminal justice system to be fair and efficient, a council really helps. I think we haven't made that argument affirmatively in the past about the merit of it to the system. And I think states and localities, what they're doing is important. I think the philanthropic community has a really big role to play here. I mean, I remember the days when in the New York, in the New York immigration court system, there was philanthropy supported legal service providers literally sitting next to the courtrooms. So anyone who needed defense could get a defense. Now that lasted only till about 3 or 4 years. And that, I think philanthropy really has to take that on as a national challenge, and that probably starts at the border.
A number of the panel members and the questioners have raised the question of how do local activists organize laterally across geographies to be effective in exerting change at the center on Washington. And especially considering the lessons from the previous panel, I think for us to be able to make the power of immigrants and their children and their allies effective in Washington, we have to be able to make the case in not just in the core central cities in the inner suburbs where immigrants and their allies are concentrated, but out in the outer suburban districts where many people are elected to Congress who either support or at least go along with the Trump administration's agenda. So my question would be, how do we make the political potential of immigrant origin communities and their allies more effective in the swing districts that are going to determine what Congress will or will not vote for? And what kind of legislation would you put in front of them, not just to serve the interests of others, but to serve the interests of the constituents in those jurisdictions where you're trying to seek support for a pro-immigrant position?
I could kick off on that question. I mean, I think one thing that's worth pointing out is that increasingly our immigrant communities are not just in, core urban areas, right? We are in, inner ring suburbs and outer ring suburbs and in, ex-urban areas, working in meat processing plants, working in, on farms. I mean, we've always, the immigrant labor has always fed this country. And so many of the nativists have significant immigrant constituents and businesses that rely on immigrant labor in their districts. And often it is some of the places that are, it is some of the inner ring suburbs where they're experiencing demographic change and where people are happy to accept immigrant labor, but we don't want immigrants to either have rights on the job, a voice on the job and democratic rights at work, or citizenship and the ability to vote, right? Even at the height of nativism in this country, it's never really been about excluding immigrants. It's been about subordinating immigrants, and I think that that's still the case today. In terms of areas where we can break through, again, I want to go back to this question around refugee resettlement, asylees, humanitarian immigration. Under this administration, there has been a concerted backlash in some of those areas. But I want to suggest that in the US in particular, the roots of anti-refugee, anti-asylee backlash are really very shallow. And that there is as much a tradition of humanitarian immigration and welcoming people who are escaping persecution. And so I think that we need to actually lean directly into that and make the case. I think there are segments of the conservative coalition who can be split off when it comes to the issues of immigration, particularly but not exclusively people who are in recognized humanitarian statuses. And of course, as others have pointed out, that's not just people who are necessarily recognized refugees or recognized asylees, but many if not most, immigrants are seeking safety, seeking freedom, seeking to be united with family, all of which are humanitarian and human rights considerations.
We have about 5 minutes left for our wonderful panel, very thoughtful, taking us in important directions. And I'm going to ask you for some concluding thoughts. And one of the concluding questions coming from the audience is, should all the elements of the pro-immigrant movement unify around the demand that there be a moratorium on deportations as a central unifying demand? So give us your concluding thoughts and maybe touch on that idea as in summing up. Christina?
Yeah, I could get started. I will say that whether everyone in the immigrant justice movement and our advocacy work agrees on that demand, I will say that people directly impacted in our communities have forced for that to be one of the central demands. And in fact, it was movement pressure that through the primary cycle pushed and forced presidential candidates to make that commitment. Even Joe Biden, who now is the presumptive nominee, responded to the pressure and the protests and the stories of undocumented people that confronted him with this question. And he himself has committed to stopping deportations in the first 100 days. What I will say, though, is that as Moose was reminding us, what would that look like in the first 100 days of an administration? And what I will say, though, with Joe Biden, if he ends up being in the White House, we're now winning a progressive candidate. What we will be winning as movement and organizers is a playing field where we can fight and push and pressure and create the conditions to win. And that's exactly what we are going to be doing. And the moment that we are having the first 100 days of the next administration, we'll be with our movement, we'll be ready to hold folks accountable in Congress and in the White House and putting the pressure, because we know that it is only by pressuring and organizing that we ever get results. On another point that I wanted to raise in terms of just closing remarks is that we are seeing hopeful signs that people are seeing their well-being and their destiny connected to that of immigrants. And you're seeing this even in places like Texas, in Houston, a few years ago. No one could believe that we can end a contract between ICE and local police. But the story there is that Black people, immigrant folks, Latinx communities, LGBTQ and trans communities came together to talk about how they were being impacted by racial profiling and police brutality, especially after the killing of Sandra Bland. And all of these organizations and communities came together to have focus on one goal: getting rid of one of the racist sheriffs in the city of Houston. And through organizing and electoralizing our fights, we were able to kick that racist sheriff out and get another sheriff in replacement. So that supported our demands, and that contract has been terminated. I wanted to share that story because that brought a coalition of immigrant and native-born people that share an experience of racial injustice and police brutality and oppression, and the impact of collaboration of ICE and local police. So as we think about rebuilding, and as we all still have able to have food in the midst of this pandemic, knowing that we're relying on undocumented labor and that folks in our communities are risking their lives to make sure that we
Christina, thank you very much. We're at our last minute. I take away from this both a number of things that we need to do in the short term in terms of immediate responses to urgent issues in the early months of 2020, and the task of building a coalition in support of a much broader set of positive policies in the years to come. And that will be the topic of the ensuing panel in a few minutes. So thank you so much to everyone for participating in this great panel and sharing the nature of your work with all the people in the audience. Much appreciated.
Thank you, folks. Thanks for joining all of you.